none comes to mind except for a book which Pope Francis has mentioned himself recently called, it was written by a British author. It's called The Lord of the Universe, which speaks kind of in a futuristic way about what could happen in the world if we lose faith. And it has a number of interesting, I can't quote the book as such, but passages in it which give a lot of food for thought in terms of the world we are living in, and perhaps present some challenges of how important it is to continue to live with faith, but also to continue to live with a deep appreciation for who we are as human beings, brothers and sisters, but understanding the relationship of ourselves with God and with the love of God in our lives. So that's one that comes to mind that I did read recently after having heard it mentioned a number of times. Pope Benedict had quoted from it, and to remind each and every bishop that before we receive ordination to the episcopate, we make a special promise or vow, if you will, of a promise to live and work in communion with the Holy Father, including obedience, So an invitation certainly for each and every bishop to reflect on that continually and to walk together to promote communion in the College of Bishops as well as, the unity with the Holy Father. The different ways we work with different bishops, that varies a lot. In the news lately, there have been things about visits to dioceses or visits to bishops. Speaking with many people, I think the spirit of synodality includes a need and a desire to listen not only to the bishop himself, but to many people in the diocese. It's kind of an exciting time to be in the church. There's a lot of surprises, personally and institutionally and worldwide, but there are great things going on.
I think you probably addressed some of this earlier, but if you could maybe expand a little bit. There are some Catholic media outlets that aren't very kind to Francis. And I just wonder what your sense of perhaps what they get wrong about as they look at him.
A very good question. Media sites nowadays, we're all familiar with a lot of them. Some of them are very good, and some of them are not. And one of the difficulties that's out there is the ordinary person who comes along and starts reading doesn't know which one you can trust. That's a big problem. And so I would just say, you got to learn to read with a very critical eye or mind. Because it's very easy to distort the truth or to mix the truth with absolute falsehood and to look for ways to do harm. And that's done also with Pope Francis. I do think that sometimes some things that he says and does are not understood by everyone. I always like to tell the story. His first World Youth Day, months after he was elected, was in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And he had this magnificent gathering with young people there, a number of gatherings, but I mean like the final mass with millions of people on the beach in Copacabana. It was as far as you could see, these millions of young people. When they say young people aren't interested in the faith, don't believe it. And rather ask yourselves, how do we draw them in? How do we promote experiences that they will actually be interested in? Francis can do that. He's really charismatic. So anyway, he's talking with all these young people, and he says to them, I'll say it in Spanish first. He says, when you go home, hagan líos para sus obispos. He says, make trouble, be troublemakers for your bishops. Well, that was, even today it's been interpreted in many different ways, but it reveals something else about Francis. When I was a religious and heard that, I clapped. But when I became a bishop, I said, oh no, what are they going to do now? Francis is a very keen mind and a very keen sense of the vision of where he wants to move the church. And he recognizes that any large institution can become just as any person. We become very set in our ways. We always did it that way. We don't want to change. We've been doing it like this forever. And one of the risks of that attitude, which is comfortable for us, it's like we create a safety zone or a security zone for ourselves, and that's wonderful. But one of the risks of that is we miss the presence of of the Holy Spirit. That breeze that may go by that says, yeah, you always did it that way, and maybe for 6 centuries it was wonderful, but maybe it's time to change. Maybe it's time to look at things differently. Maybe it's time to recognize that all of us grow and change and learn new things, and that the Holy Spirit may be leading the church to build, for example, a church like this one, and not a long, narrow, whatever church like might have been built in the 1940s. Simple example, but I mean, there's so many things in terms of how we understand building up church community that could be new. And so Francis is not afraid to rock the boat a bit, to shake things up. And when he does that, there are people who are uncomfortable. We all have different personalities, and we all have kind of different ways of, wanting to keep the boat calm and please don't rock the boat. Please don't do that. And Francis is like, you'll be all right. He likes the gospel with Jesus. It looks like he's sleeping in the boat there, and the disciples are panicking, and they're like, what are you sleeping for? We're going to die. And Jesus knows very well what's going on, but he lets them be shaken up. And so with that, I think sometimes some of what he's doing is not understood correctly. And one of the things, and I would invite all of you to think about this. I mean, everyone is free to think and interpret as they wish, But we as Catholics have always believed, and I firmly believe, what Jesus himself said, the Holy Spirit will never abandon the church. Don't doubt that. The Holy Spirit was part, in some way, shape, or form. I wasn't there, but I truly believe that Pope Francis was elected by that College of Cardinals in 2013 because the church at this time needs Francis. At a different time, we needed Pope Benedict, and at a different time, we needed St. John Paul II, et cetera, et cetera. But the Holy Spirit will never abandon the church, and if we can live placing our trust in that, yeah, we might be shaken up a bit. We might need to ask questions, and there's a lot of people we can ask questions to. But we continue to walk, placing our trust and our confidence in the Lord, whose Spirit is indeed with us. So I think, without going into details in specific cases, I think that sort of helps, at least as I've heard from some people, why does Francis do that? And I'm confused, and I don't like that. And, well, let's relax a little bit and trust in the Lord.
My last point or question, we're going to move on, obviously, to Mass right after. And you've alluded to this. One last hopeful message about the church today.
Just one.
As many as you like.
By coincidence or divine providence, next year, 2025, is a Jubilee year. A lot of people don't know what Jubilee years are about, but it's basically a concept from the Old Testament when for us, every 25 years, a special year is chosen, and the church, in specific ways, offers what I was talking about earlier in terms of God's mercy and forgiveness to people. It really comes from a time in the Old Testament when it wasn't only a spiritual thing, it was also a material thing. Debts were pardoned. Oftentimes in former days, and not that long ago, when slavery existed, or when people became indentured servants because they owed money and they couldn't pay it off, so they in effect became slaves to someone else. Every 25 years, people were freed, and debts were pardoned. And people said, let's start over again and do this right. Boy, have we gone a long way from that sense. We allow individuals and countries in the world to accumulate debts of trillions of dollars, so we will never pardon them because not everybody believes in a jubilee. However, there is an element in the Gospels, with the whole Scriptures, Old Testament, New Testament, which again, with Pope Francis, is, I think, very strong, which is precisely to offer a message of hope. And in fact, next year's Jubilee year is dedicated to the message of hope. And so